In this 3-part series, I am going to be teaching you how you can jump out of automatic mode and into manual mode by looking at the 3 main components that you need to be able to fully understand how to shoot manually. These 3 components are aperture, shutter speed and ISO, which in turn make up the exposure triangle. Changing any of these 3 components can change your exposure, but we need to understand why and what they change. Today's video is going to be focusing on aperture. So, I think the easiest way to think about aperture is if we compare it to the pupil in our eye. Your pupil expands and contracts depending on the amount of light in your environment. If you are in a dark environment, your pupil will expand, but if you're in a really bright environment, it will contract. So with that in mind, you can change the size of the aperture to allow more or less light in. So with the aperture open wider, more light falls onto the sensor, but when the aperture is small, less light falls onto the sensor. Now the confusing bit. In day-to-day life, say 16 would be bigger than 2.8 or 3.2 or 5.6, right? Well, in photography, 2.8 is the biggest out of them numbers, and 16 is the smallest. So let me explain. At 2.8, the iris of the lens is larger and therefore letting more light into the sensor than say at f16. The size of the iris at f16 is very small, so it wouldn't let as much light into the sensor. So a great feature of having a larger aperture would mean that when you're taking photos in darker places, it can allow more light into your sensor. So I'm hearing you ask, Rob, how do I tell what aperture I'm at? Well, I'll tell you. If you look at your camera, you'll probably notice the letter F followed by a number. This is what you call your f-stop. So the f-stop is the size of the aperture, and this can range from say 1.4 to f22. They're just examples. But it all depends on what you're shooting. So the smaller the f-stop, the larger the aperture. So the largest aperture on this end is 1.4 and the largest on this is 3.5. As well as letting more or less light in, it can affect the depth of field, also known as background blur. With a larger aperture, it will allow more light in but create a shallower depth of field. So picking the right aperture depends on your subject and setting. Say I am shooting a portrait on an object, I prefer a shallower depth of field, so the background is more blurred whilst the subject is in focus. But if I am shooting a landscape photo, I will want a deeper depth of field to get more in focus. So remember, the larger your aperture, the more light that is let in, so you'll have to compensate by adjusting your shutter speed and ISO, which will be explained in further videos. If you fancy trying to get your head around aperture until you learn about shutter speed and ISO, I'd suggest putting your camera into aperture priority mode, which can be found by the symbols either A or AV on your camera, depending on what body you have and what company it's made by. This allows you to control the aperture whilst the camera works out the ISO and shutter speed for you, as the other 2 components are then automatic. It may not always get the photo you're wanting, but for the time being it gets you used to understanding more about aperture. So that is all on my basic video on aperture. If you have any questions, please leave them down in the comments below, and on the way down there click the like button and subscribe if you want to see more content in the future. Thank you very much.